But before that, we will discuss very briefly the idea of international communication. Actually, the department offers a full-fledged course on international communication. It will be offered in this coming spring as well. Here we are only going to familiarize ourselves. My purpose is to familiarize you with this idea of international communication. We all know what is communication. Let's talk about the idea of international communication. What comes in your mind with the word international communication?
Globalized communication. Globalized communication.
Global communication, communication across borders. Let's discuss some examples. GeoTV in Pakistan is not an example of international communication. It has viewership within country, within this nation, which is national, certainly not international. Similarly, Junk newspaper, Navaivat newspaper, Dawn newspaper, they have national level readership. Dawn is not a newspaper which is read across the globe or around the world. So this is again not an example of international communication. However, whenever we are talking about the idea of international communication, let's think about media that qualify the criteria of international. Media that is viewed across the globe, newspapers that are read around the world are the examples of international communication. Reader's Digest is an example of international communication. Time magazine is another example of international communication. Think about the New York Times. Even sometimes if you take a look at the contents of New York Times, they have sections, Asia section, Africa section, Europe. Same is the case with The Guardian, which is a British newspaper with international readership. So they have these separate editions because they know that their newspapers are read across the globe. That is, these newspapers are examples of international communication. Let's talk about BBC. How many of you have access to BBC through your cable network? My cable operator gives us access to BBC. Most Pakistanis have access to BBC through cable TV. Same is the case with CNN, cable news network. It is also an example of international communication. And whenever there is an event of an event that has international importance, like 9/11 was one of them. So I remember what happened right after 9/11, people quickly tuned in to CNN and BBC to know what had happened because the news that was coming from there was of course credible. What Pakistani news channels were showing at that time, for that information they were dependent on international media. Maybe they did not have any correspondent who's there to cover the news story. But these news channels, of course, they had international reach. They have a team of foreign correspondents. New York Times, Declan Walsh. Is anyone familiar with Declan Walsh? Declan Walsh is a journalist, is an American journalist who is associated with the New York Times. He was placed in Pakistan for many years until he was forced to leave country by Pakistan establishment for some political reasons. We're not going into that. But Declan Walsh is famous for covering many significant investigative stories, and one of them was Exact scandal. You may remember there was an it's with AXAZT. There was this firm, a fake firm that was awarding degrees to Pakistani students, and they proclaimed that they were affiliated with foreign universities. Actually, they were not. So they were awarding these fake degrees to Pakistani students, and the story was first investigated by Declan Walsh, New York Times correspondent, New York Times correspondent who was based in Pakistan. And he worked on this news story for months, and he sent it to get published in the New York Times. The New York Times was the newspaper that first time revealed this, the first time published the story. The story was later picked up by Pakistani newspapers. Well, international media is saying this, well, this is what is happening in our country. right under our nose. And so what I'm saying is that these international communication channels, they have international reach. They have a team of correspondents, team of journalists who are spread around the world because they have resources, they have revenue to operate on international scale. Anyways, we were talking about international communication, and I gave you a plethora of examples to explain what international communication is. Let's proceed. Again, in order to understand, in order to comprehend the model of international communication, it is very important for us to make sense of what international communication is. In these slides, these are 4 slides only, we will only make sense of what international communication is, and then we will proceed with just one model that we will be studying for this element. Alright, what is international communication? I have already discussed it, communication across borders, and I have given you examples as well. Would anyone like to come up with any other example that I maybe forgot to share, or I couldn't share? Any other example? Netflix.
Yes.
Isn't that international communication? Like, and now they have started broadcasting. Earlier they were broadcasting Indian content. Now they have started broadcasting Pakistani content as well. You can see Pakistani dramas there. Hollywood, by the way, Hollywood is one of the biggest examples of international communication. It is viewed across the world. The whole world is crazy for Hollywood. And like people watch their movies, they are released beyond boundaries. International communication is a kind of communication that doesn't have any boundary. See, Dawn, Jung, Geo, Navaipat, D News, D Nation, they have boundaries. They are viewed within a country. They are for a specific target audience. But these channels we were talking about, they do not have any boundaries. They have international viewership. Alright. Everyone concept clear what international communication is and what are its examples? Alright, let's talk about repercussions of international communication. By the way, this is one of my favorite topics whenever international communication, because it has it kind of entails issues that are related to marginalization, that are related to dependency, imperialism and all that. We'll talk about that in a minute, but this is one of my favorite topics and I love to talk about this. What is the meaning of the word repercussions?
Maybe consequences.
Yes, repercussions mean consequences, unintended consequences, like consequences, effects that are there, but they were not planned by the person who is like kind of creating those consequences, and especially the consequences that are unwelcoming, like the consequences that are not kind of positive, kind of negative consequences. So repercussions of international communication. Okay, I'll stop here to ask you a question. When we talk about international communication, does it come with negative consequences? Like we're talking about Netflix, we are talking about BBC, we are talking about CNN, we are talking about the New York Times, The Guardian. Like, what can be the negative effects of international communication? Are there any? Does anything come in your mind when you talk about repercussions?
Well, they can portray our country in a different way.
That's a very good point. I'm so happy that you brought this up. So, Aisha is saying that they tend to portray things in a specific way. What she's trying to say is, what about the promotion of stereotypes? What about the promotion of prejudices? What about the promotion of biases? I don't remember, what was the model where we discussed Disney's movie Aladdin? What was that model? I said, not propaganda model for sure. I have forgotten, my bad. But anyways, so see, here is this powerful media. I know Hollywood is giant, aren't they? That is a giant. The kind of messages they tend to promote about someone, sometimes, they can create stereotypes. They can, yes, promote prejudices, biases, and they can kind of create specific sort of mindsets about who belong to a particular ethnicity, people who belong to a particular race, people who belong to a particular area, geographical area, in this case Middle East, of course. So yes, there can be repercussions as well. So here we are going to talk about repercussions. Apparently, it seems international communication is a wonderful thing. See, I mean, what happens in any developed part of the world, we get to see that. We get to see that through these international communication channels. Or just think about the sort of entertainment that Hollywood provides you, like all the action movies, all the fantasy movies, all the the movies that come with so much glamour effects and computerized effects. That all sounds very fascinating. Of course, it is fascinating.